Anne of Brittany was a French queen who reigned as Duchess of Brittany from 1488 until her death. Upon her father's death in 1488, she became Sovereign Duchess of Brittany, Countess of Nantes, Montfort and Richmond, and Viscountess of Limoges. After his death she became a central figure in the struggle for influence that led to the union of Brittany and France. She is highly regarded in Brittany as a conscientious ruler who defended the duchy. Life, early years and education. Anne was born on 25 January 1477 in the castle of the Dukes of Brittany in the city of Nantes in what is now the Loire-Atlantique département of France. As the eldest child of Duke Francis II of Brittany and his second wife Margaret of Foix, Infanta of Navarre. 4 years later, her parents had a second daughter, Isabel. It is likely that she learned to read and write in French, and perhaps a little Latin. Contrary to what is sometimes claimed, it was unlikely that she learned Greek or Hebrew and never spoke or understood the Breton language. She was raised by a governess, Françoise de Dinan, Lady of Chateaubriand, and by marriage Countess of Laval. In addition, she had several tutors, including her butler and court poet, Jean Mechinote, who was thought to have taught her dancing, singing and music. Heiress of Brittany. In this period, the law of succession was unclear, but prior to the Breton War of Succession mainly operated according to semi-Salic law, i.e., women could inherit, but only if the male line had died out. The Treaty of Guérande in 1365, however, stated that in the absence of a male heir from the House of Montfort, the heirs of Joanna of Penthièvre would succeed. By the time Anne was born, her father was the only male from the Breton House of Montfort, and the Blois-Penthièvre heir was a female, Nicole of Blois, who in 1480 sold her rights over Brittany to King Louis XI of France for the amount of 50,000 écus. The lack of a male heir gave rise to the threat of a dynastic crisis in the duchy, or to its passing directly into the royal domain. To avoid this, Francis II had Anne officially recognized as his heiress by the Estates of Brittany on 10 February 1486. However, the question of her marriage remained a diplomatic issue. Betrothals. Anne was betrothed a number of times. In 1480 she was officially promised in marriage to Edward, Prince of Wales, son of Edward IV of England. However, soon after the death of Edward IV in 1483 the boy disappeared, presumed to have been killed on the orders of his regent, Richard III. Maximilian, King of the Romans and Archduke of Austria, widower of Mary of Burgundy, daughter and heiress of Charles the Bold. Alan I of Albret, son of Catherine of Rohan and Jean I of Albret. Through his mother, he was a great-grandson of Duke John V of Brittany, and thus a possible heir. Although he was an ally of Duke Francis II, Anne refused to marry him because she found him repulsive. Louis, Duke of Orleans, cousin of King Charles VIII and in turn future king, was another aspirant for her hand, despite being already married to the king's sister Joan. John IV of Chalon-Arlay, Prince of Orange, a grandson of Richard, Count of Étampes, and nephew of Francis II, he was in line to the throne after Anne and Isabel. Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham. In 1488 Henry VII had suggested a marriage between Buckingham and Anne, but in December 1489 the executors of Henry Percy, 4th Earl of Northumberland, paid the king £4,000 for Buckingham's marriage to Percy's eldest daughter Eleanor, Viscount John II of Rohan, also in line to the Breton throne, offered with the support of Marshal Jean-David Rieux a double marriage of his sons François and Jean with Anne and her sister Isabel. But Francis II opposed this plan. Marriages. In 1488, the armies of Francis II were defeated at the Battle of Saint-Auban-du-Cormier, ending the Mad War between Brittany and France. In the Treaty of Sablé, which concluded the peace settlement, the Duke was forced to accept clauses stipulating that his daughters were not to marry without the approval of the King of France. With the death of Francis II soon afterwards as a result of a fall from his horse, Brittany was plunged into fresh crisis. leading to the final Franco-Breton War. On his deathbed, the Duke made his daughter promise never to consent to the subjugation of the duchy to the Kingdom of France. Before he died, Francis II appointed the Marshal of Rieux guardian of his daughter, after fleeing Nantes following the division of her advisers over the issue of her marriage. Anne was crowned Duchess of Brittany in Rennes on 10 February 1489. She married Maximilian I of Austria at Rennes Cathedral by proxy on 19 December 1490, which conferred upon her the title Queen of the Romans. The French regarded it as a serious provocation. It not only violated the Treaty of Sablé, but also reintroduced an enemy of the French as ruler of Brittany, which they had wanted to avoid during the 14th and 15th centuries. The marriage also proved ill-timed. The Habsburgs were too busy in Hungary to pay any serious attention to Brittany, and the Castilians were busy fighting in Granada. Although both Castile and England sent small numbers of troops to supplement the ducal army, neither wished for open warfare with France. The spring of 1491 brought new successes by the French general La Trémoille, and King Charles VIII of France came to lay siege to Rennes, where Anne stayed, in order to force her to desist from her Habsburg marriage. After 2 months of siege without assistance and unable to resist any longer, Rennes fell. Charles VIII entered in the city on 15 November, and both parties signed the Treaty of Rennes, ending the fourth military campaign of the French over Brittany. After refusing all proposed marriages with French princes, Anne became engaged to the king in the vault of the Jacobins in Rennes on 17 November 1491. Then, escorted by her army, Anne went to Langeres to be married. Austria made diplomatic protests, claiming that the marriage was illegal because the bride was unwilling, that she was already legally married to Maximilian, and that Charles VIII was legally betrothed to Margaret of Austria, Maximilian's daughter. The official marriage between Anne and King Charles VIII of France was celebrated in the Great Hall of the Château de Langeres on 6 December 1491 at dawn. The ceremony was concluded discreetly and urgently because it was technically illegal until Pope Innocent VIII, in exchange for substantial concessions, validated the union on 15 February 1492 and granted the annulment to the marriage by proxy with Maximilian, and also give the dispensation for the marriage with Charles VIII, needed because the king and Anne were related in the forbidden fourth degree of consanguinity. The marriage contract provided that the spouse who outlived the other would retain possession of Brittany. However, it also stipulated that if Charles VIII died without male heirs, Anne would marry his successor, thus ensuring the French kings a second chance to permanently annex Brittany. Queen of France by the marriage of 1491, Anne of Brittany became Queen Consort of France. Her marriage contract stated that it was concluded to ensure peace between the Duchy of Brittany and the Kingdom of France. She made Charles VIII her perpetual representative. On 8 February 1492, Anne was crowned Queen of France at St. Denis Basilica. She was the first queen crowned there and consecrated, anointed in the head and chest by André d'Espinay, Archbishop of Bordeaux. Her husband forbade her to use the title of Duchess of Brittany, which became a bone of contention between the two. Gabriel Moran became the Chancellor of the Queen and her first doctor. He signed the marriage contract of the Queen with King Louis XII on 1 January 1499. Anne's marriage began badly. She brought 2 beds with her when she came to marry Charles, and the king and queen often lived apart. Despite this, she was pregnant for most of her married life. When her husband fought in the wars in Italy, the regency powers were exercised by his sister Anne of Beaujeu, who had held this position between 1483 to 1491. Anne of Brittany had a limited role in France and Brittany and sometimes had to accept being separated from her children in infancy. She lived primarily in the royal castles of Amboise, Loches and Plessis, or in the towns of Lyon, Grenoble or Moulins. At Amboise, when Charles VIII had work, she mainly resided in the nearby Clos Lucé, the future home of Leonardo da Vinci. She built her chapel. She became Queen Consort of Naples and Jerusalem during the conquest of Naples by Charles VIII. Duchess of Brittany in remarriage when Charles VIII, heir of the rights of the kings of France over Brittany, died as the result of an accident on 4 April 1498. Anne was 21 years old and without surviving children. She then personally took charge of the administration of the Duchy of Brittany. She restored the faithful Philippe de Montauban to the Chancellery of Brittany, named Jean de Chalon, Prince of Orange, as hereditary Lieutenant General of Brittany, convened the Estates of Brittany, and ordered production of a gold coin bearing her name and appointed his squire Giles of Texture as responsible of the Château de Brest. Around her, there was a famous circle of court poets, among them the Italian humanist Publio Fausto Andrelini from Filai, historian Jean Lemaire de Belges and poet Jean Marot. She also took into her service the most famous musicians of her time: Johannes Ockeghem, Antoine de Favon, Loisette Compère and Jean Mouton. Anne of Brittany was undoubtedly the first queen of France to appear as a patron sought after by artists and writers of her time. 3 days after her husband's death, the terms of her marriage contract came into force. However, the new king, Louis XII, was already married to Joan, daughter of Louis XI and sister to Charles VIII. On 19 August 1498, at Étampes, Anne agreed to marry Louis XII if he obtained an annulment from Joan within a year. Days later, the process for the annulment of the marriage between Louis XII and Joan of France began. In the interim, Anne returned to Brittany in October 1498. If Anne was gambling that the annulment would be denied, she lost. Louis's first marriage was dissolved by Pope Alexander VI before the end of the year. Anne's third marriage contract, signed the day of her marriage, was concluded under conditions radically different from those of the second. She was no longer a child, but a dowager queen, and determined to ensure the recognition of her rights as sovereign duchess from that point forward. Although her new husband exercised the ruler's powers in Brittany, he formally recognized her right to the title, Duchess of Brittany, and issued decisions in her name. Also, she ensured that their second child, son or daughter, would inherit the Duchy of Brittany, a clause that would not be respected in the future. Anne's second coronation ceremony as Louis XII's consort took place on 18 November 1504, again at St. Denis Basilica. Anne lived mainly at the Château de Blois, where the presence of the Duchess of Brittany was visible everywhere. She built the tomb of her parents at Nantes Cathedral with the symbols of the four virtues: courage, temperance, justice and prudence, that she always tried to wear. All Italian arts were appreciated by the Queen. During an illness of Louis XII, she made a tour of Brittany as Duchess, and fiercely defended the independence of her duchy. She arranged the marriage of her daughter, Claude, heiress of the duchy, to Charles of Austria, to reinforce the Franco-Spanish alliance and ensure French success in the Italian wars. The marriage contract was signed on 10 August 1501 in Lyon by François de Busleyden, Archbishop of Besançon, William de Croix, Nicolas de Rota and Pierre Leserman, all ambassadors of Duke Philip of Burgundy, Charles's father. However, the engagement was cancelled by Louis XII when it became likely that Anne would not produce a male heir. Instead, Louis XII arranged a marriage between Claude and the heir to the French throne, Francis of Angoulême. Anne, determined to maintain Breton independence, refused until death to sanction the marriage, pushing instead for Claude to marry Charles, or for her other daughter, Renée, to inherit the duchy. It is at this point that she took the opportunity to tour the duchy, visiting many places she had never been able to see as a child. Officially it was a pilgrimage to the Breton shrines, but in reality it was a political journey and an act of independence that sought to assert her sovereignty over the duchy. From June to September 1505, she made triumphal entries into the cities of the duchy, where her vassals received her sumptuously. In addition, she ensured the proper collection of taxes. Death. Exhausted by many pregnancies and miscarriages, Anne died of a kidney stone attack in the Château de Blois at 6 a.m. on 9 January 1514, after having dictated in her will the customary partition of her body with multiple burials, a privilege of the Capetian dynasty, which allowed for multiple ceremonies and places. Anne's will also conferred the succession of Brittany upon her second daughter, Renée. Her husband ignored this, confirmed Claude as Duchess, and married her to Francis the year following Anne's death. When Francis became king in 1515, the Duchy of Brittany was once again the property of the Queen Consort of France. She was buried in the necropolis of Saint Denis. Her funeral was exceptionally long, lasting 40 days, and it inspired all future French royal funerals until the 18th century. On this occasion, the Herald of Arms of Brittany Pierre Choquet pronounced for the first time the traditional lament, La Reine est morte, La Reine est morte, La Reine est morte. Choquet also recorded that two masses were read, the first by the Cordeliers and the second by the Jacobins. Two requiems were also sung, possibly those that survived by Johannes Prioris and Antoine de Faven. Separate mourning motets by other members of the two royal choirs also survive. Quis dabit oculis by Costanzo Festa and Fier Atropos by Pierre Mou. According to her will, Anne's heart was placed in a raised enamel gold reliquary, then transported to Nantes to be deposited in her parents' tomb in the chapel of the Carmelite friars. This was done on 19 March 1514, but it was later transferred to the Saint Pierre Cathedral. Anne's reliquary is a bivalvular box oval articulated by a hinge, made of a sheet of gold pushed back and gilliqued, broadside of a gold cordeliera and topped by a crown of lily and clover. It is inscribed on the obverse as follows: NCE petit vaisseau de fin or per munder reposung plus grand que on que dame eutio under an fuch le nom d'elle en France de Foisroin, Duchess des Bretons royale et souveraine. It was made by an anonymous goldsmith of the court of Blois, perhaps drawn by Jean Perreault, in 1792, by order of the National Convention. The reliquary was disinterred and emptied as part of the collection of precious metals belonging to churches. It was sent to Paris to be melted down, but was kept instead in the National Library. It was returned to Nantes in 1819 and kept in various museums. It has been in the Dobré Museum since 1896. The double mausoleum Louis XII and Anne of Brittany, carved in Carrara marble, was installed at Saint Denis Basilica in 1830. The bell dachshund was in arcades, and in the base of the sarcophagus were depicted the victories of Louis XII. Statues of the 12 apostles and the 4 cardinal virtues, the work of the Just brothers, Italian sculptors who received the order in 1515. The transient orans before a prie-dieu crowning the platform are attributed to Guillaume Regnault. The tomb was desecrated during the Revolution on 18 October 1793 and the bodies were thrown into a mass grave. Alexandre Lenoir saved much of the monument, who was preserved in the Museum of French Monuments in 1795 before being returned to the Royal Basilica under the Second Bourbon Restoration. Personal characteristics. Anne was a highly intelligent woman who spent much of her time on the administration of Brittany. She was described as shrewd, proud and haughty in manner. She made the safeguarding of Breton autonomy, and the preservation of the duchy outside the French crown, her life's work. Although that goal would prove failed shortly after her death, Anne was also a patron of the arts and enjoyed music. A prolific collector of tapestries. It is very likely that the unicorn tapestries now on view at the Cloisters Museum in New York City were commissioned by her in celebration of her wedding to Louis XII. Of her 4 surviving illuminated manuscript books of hours, the most famous is the Grands Jours of Anne of Brittany. She also patronized printed books and their authors. She was a devoted mother, spending as much time as possible with her children. She commissioned a book of prayers for her son, Charles Orland, to use in teaching him how to pray, and as guidance for his role as future King of France. Unfortunately, Charles Orland died in 1495, and no other son lived more than a few weeks. According to the Memoirs of Brangham, and greatly expanded her household and retinue at court, especially in respect to young girls, forming a kind of finishing school, and in having a company of 100 Breton gentlemen at court. These innovations influenced later French courts. At her marriage to Charles VIII at age 14, Anne was described as a young and rosy-cheeked girl. By the time of her marriage to Louis, aged 22, after 7 pregnancies with no surviving children, she was described as pale-faced and wan. By the end of her life, at 36, she had been pregnant 14 times, from which only 2 children survived.